It's the most common gripe about American politics. Why is everything so polarized, and how do we fix it? While pundits frequently talk about polarization, few focus on identifying and replicating success stories and reducing it. In the Depolarizers, a new podcast series from Welcome, we'll dive into the history of polarization and the people dedicated to moving past our era of intransigence. Each episode of our first season will explore a different theme of polarization in conversation with the experts who are working toward a more depolarized America. In today's episode, we'll talk about the history of polarization with Slow Boring's Matt Yglesias and the Polarizers' Sam Rosenfeld. We'll discuss why and how polarization was intentionally created for the two American political parties in the mid-20th century, the effects of polarization in today's political environment, and different factors that influence both voters and elected officials' perspectives when it comes to partisan polarization. Thanks for joining us, and hope you enjoy it. Today's guests are Sam Rosenfeld, Associate Professor of Political Science at Colgate University, specializing in party politics and American political development, and author of The Polarizers and his new book with Daniel Schlozman, The Hollow Parties, as well as author and journalist Matt Yglesias, who co-founded Vox in 2014 and now writes and produces the incredibly popular and fabulous Substack publication Slow Boring. Matt and Sam, it's great to have you.
Hi, good to be here.
Great to be here.
So Matt, thanks for being here. And I would love for you to talk about why you think polarization is a choice. You've written about this at length in Slow Boring, and you've mentioned in your piece that polarization absolutely does have an underlying structural cause, but it's also shaped by deliberate choices that politicians and other political elites make. Can you delve into that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been working in DC as a journalist for about 21 years now. And something that I've seen during this time is a lot of real effort has been made by politicians to sort of chase money and volunteers who they see as activated by being sort of relatively extreme. And there's been, a tendency by issue advocates to encourage that kind of behavior, to be very organized, to be very adept, to be putting a lot of money into the political system, to be trying to cultivate champions who have relatively extreme kinds of positions, and to put out sort of meta information about the nature of politics that really emphasizes sort of turnout-based strategies versus persuasion, that I think hides the ball a little bit in terms of the actual opinions of non-voters, which tend to be fairly moderate in point of fact. It's not like every person who's operating in the system operates in the context of other people's choices. So they're responding to a certain set of incentives, but a critical element of that incentives, I think, is that there's been a asymmetrical mobilization of people so that, Democratic Party donors are more extreme than Democratic Party elected officials, who themselves tend to be more extreme than Democratic Party voters. And everyone is kind of pulling on that string, and you see something broadly similar on the Republican side.
And Sam, you literally wrote the book on polarization. Can you talk about the history of polarization and literally how we got here?
Sure. I start the book, and I'll start now just by way of illustration, not because I think these specific people were the quintessential polarizers. But in 1950, the American Political Science Association, they had set up a committee on political parties that was headed up by an eminent scholar named E. Schatzschneider. And in 1950, they put out their report. And this report, it was just a bunch of political scientists writing up something, but it was distributed to Harry Truman, the president, read it. Members of Congress read it. It got written up in newspapers. And the report's kind of central critique of the American political system as of 1950 was that essentially that the American political parties were not polarized enough. They didn't use the word polarize. They used a term called party responsibility, by which they meant a party responsibility. Responsible parties were parties that were oriented around distinct policy agendas and had sufficient kind of internal cohesion and discipline to commit themselves to that distinct agenda. so that they could then be held accountable by voters. People knew who to hold collectively responsible for governance. And in 1950, that did not describe American political parties in reality. Both because American parties at mid-century were still quite decentralized as entities with really empowered, organizationally influential, subnational, kind of state and local organizations, a lot of whom, even though this was long after the heyday of like 19th century patronage-based machines, a lot of them were just not oriented around national policy issues or national issue conflicts. And you had this very distinct and very influential regional force, the American South, which was solidly Democratic for longstanding historical reasons, and whose political elites in Congress, in state government, tended to be extremely conservative. So you had already, not just on civil rights and questions of the racial order, but on questions of the welfare state, of organized labor, of kind of activist national government writ large. And so you had this, a national Democratic Party that coming out of the New Deal had become the party of kind of activist government on behalf of regulation and redistribution, et cetera. But containing within it some of the most conservative actors in American politics. And due to certain features of national American political institutions like the congressional committee system, seniority, et cetera, they were actually more empowered than their numbers would suggest. And that just meant you had two parties, because there was also kind of moderate and progressive forces in the Republican Party. You had two parties that did not that were cross-cut by ideological divides. The ideological divisions in the country did not match the partisan division on issue after issue after issue. And so these political scientists, they are articulating a kind of normative, small d democratic critique of this. They think it was bad because having muddy parties that had no that weren't differentiated clearly on ideology or policy agendas meant that voters were robbed of a kind of meaningful choice at the voting booth, and then they were robbed of the ability to figure out who to hold collectively responsible for outcomes because all the policymaking was done on such a bipartisan basis. They also, these political scientists, tended to be liberal New Deal Democrats in their, life as citizens. And they thought also, and their fellow New Deal liberal Democrats, as kind of factional actors in American politics, took up this critique and the kind of language of party responsibility as their own, as Matt was saying, kind of meta story about what's going on with American politics, because they were frustrated with this dissident minority in their own party, these Southern conservatives entering into coalition with conservative Republicans to stop all this kind of liberal policies to fulfill the promise of the New Deal, to fulfill the promise of Reconstruction in advancing civil rights. And that became the kind of language they used to wage factional battle with especially Southern Democrats, also the kind of residual state and local party machines who still had a lot of clout in internal party decision making. And so liberal Democrats are pushed for a series of reforms to how Congress works, how the committee system operates, the relative power of rank and file members of Congress and party leaders vis-a-vis committees. They end up pushing for changes in party nominations in the presidential nominating system. And on the flip side, the conservative movement emerges in the early post-war era, never goes in for the same language of kind of political science-y party responsibility, and never is as interested in kind of process reform. But they articulate a similar critique of what they call Me Too Republicanism. Later, they're complaining about Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They're calling for a choice, not an echo. This is all kind of, progenitors of Rhino, of accusing Republicans of being kind of pale imitations of Democrats rather than standing for something distinct. They too are waging factional battle against liberal and moderate Republicans, and in more and less at different times explicit agreement with liberal Democrats that what they'd like to do is realign the South so that conservative voters in the South are Republicans rather than Democrats, generate more of an ideologically defined and ideologically sorted party system, and through a whole series of factional fights and reforms by the 1970s, that's essentially the system that you get. You get a system that has become much more permeable and defined by the desires of issue-driven and ideologically driven activists on both sides. They are now kind of running the show much more in their respective parties, and we've been living with that dynamic ever since.
What I think's interesting about this, though, is, Sam's talking about starting in a situation where the parties are, they're poorly sorted, right? Like, many of the most conservative members of Congress are Democrats, and some relatively liberal members of Congress are Republicans. And this work goes in to sort them out so that the Democrats are clearly the more liberal party, Republicans are clearly the more conservative party. And, by sometime in the 80s, like that's the case, right? Like, we have achieved the dream of the APSA report. And like the parties have national programs. Even if Michael Dukakis says this is about competence, not ideology, like everybody knows he's more liberal than Ronald Reagan. Congressional Democrats are more liberal than congressional Republicans. And like, we're doing politics, right? Like issue-based politics. What's fascinating to me is the extent to which the process continues from there, right? So that it's not a like sorting of the parties into a more progressive and a more conservative one, but a creation of this like kill zone of issue positions in which nobody is running on the platform that is like not as conservative as Ted Cruz, but still distinctly less liberal than the average Democrat, right? So like Beto O'Rourke, he runs this race against Cruz. It's very right wing, not that personable. It's a great year for Democrats, but he like runs this like super conventional down the line liberal Democrat campaign, and that's it's both related to the historical process that Sam is talking about, but is also different from the original critique, because, there was always, right, like they're saying, well, we want to have nationalized party politics, right, instead of this completely federated system, but we still have federated elections, right? Like that's not something that they're able to change. Who the median voter is, like, varies a lot from place to place. And there's kind of a question, right, is like, should you try to target that locally median voter, or should you like run as if we're having national proportional representation and just kind of hope for the best? And I think, both parties, not exclusively, like, Joe Manchin played a critical role in this Congress, but all these people were like really upset at him, even as they would acknowledge that it's not like there were great prospects for electing a solid progressive from one of the most conservative states in the country. And now he's retiring, right? Which is, that is the other aspect of polarization being a choice, is people get frustrated and quit. And we have, some younger blue dog Democrats and stuff like that. But there's been a lot of exit from the system by more moderate people.
Yeah. And I want to get back to the in real life depolarizers in Congress in just a second, Matt. But to take a step back, going back to the OG polarizers, I guess we'll call them, In your book, Sam, you had this awesome political cartoon that I can't remember who wrote it or who drew it, but it had like these like disfigured looking disfigured looking elephant, and then a disfigured looking Democrat. Because to your point, there wasn't a great distinction between what was a Democrat versus what was a Republican, and so you're saying, you and Matt both are saying, there had to have been some distinction in the political party system so that people could feel like they could progress things, right? And even, in your book and even in some of Matt's writing, they've mentioned, Civil Rights Act had to happen because for obvious reasons, but Civil Rights Act had to happen, but it wouldn't have gone anywhere had we not had that distinction in the party ideology, particularly with the Southern Democrats, right? So, can you maybe talk more about why the polarization had to happen to begin with, and why they felt like government couldn't government properly without sort of the distinction here?
Yeah, well, I chronicle the rise of polarizers who end up winning, but they're fighting a battle the whole time, and there is a kind of a counter argument that you get articulated by lots of people, including people like Lyndon Johnson, who are in the grand sweep of history we now think of as a deeply activist and kind of liberal actor in policymaking. But he was not a fan of polarized parties by any means. And all throughout this, particularly the minority, both moderate and liberal Republicans, who thought of themselves as representing a proud, important tradition in American politics that went back a century, and Southern Democrats, and to a certain extent, kind of party regulars, leaders of local party organizations, they all talked about how the American political system was always great for being these two parties are big tents that aren't organized around ideology. They represent inside of them the great diversity and pluralism of groups and interests and ideas in American life. And they better fit a political system that is by design highly fragmented and differentiated, the kind of Madisonian political system of separated powers and federalism. And that this was this kind of foreign idea of disciplined, ideologically defined parliamentary style parties that these reformers were trying to cram into the system. And so they articulated that. And to a certain extent, there is some degree of prescience in some of that critique, even as it's being made. But from the point of view, civil rights becomes the major fulcrum. On the one hand, motivating activists who see real obstruction happening by minority elements of their own party that are empowered by longstanding kind of features of how Congress especially operates, to thwart an agenda that both has a lot of moral force behind it that grows ever more by the early 60s. But they also, if you count the votes, like there's majority support in Congress for this, if not for these features. And so they do kind of run together a critique of the party system with a critique of these particular kinds of forces like seniority in the committee system in the crusade for civil rights that leads to civil rights breakthroughs in 1964 and 1965. Following on, though, is then the further sorting of the parties. It's you get kind of the actual electoral realignment of the South in part as a consequence of these breakthroughs around civil rights, and you get further reforms that happen into the 1970s. Writ large, I will say everything is done by human actors, and there's nothing inevitable about the tides and forces of history. But there is a powerful sense going all the way back to progressive era, the rise of industrialized society and state administration of capitalist society. You get more of an argument that policy and policy mindedness should govern in a more conscientious way how politics is organized through parties or through other kinds of actors, technocrats, experts, et cetera. And that's a big kind of powerful thrust that is running through all of this. A part of this is a story of the kind of activist base of party politics becomes better educated, becomes more middle class, becomes less and less the kind of iconic working class urban immigrant communities that powered the patronage-based materialist politics of 19th century machines over the course of the 20th century. And those activists are motivated to get engaged in politics because of they care about actual particular policy issues.
And, and on the conservative side too, right? I mean, there's a sort of, I mean, you don't necessarily need to admire their work, but like the logic of essays being like, well, we shouldn't have like half the conservatives in the country voting for Democrats who then put liberal presidents in office. Like they should all vote for the same party. Like that just makes a lot of sense, right? Like that's a pretty compelling pitch on its own face. And real work went into that, right? Into saying, instead of this kind of informal conservative coalition in Congress, we should have like an actual ideological movement that can gain and wield power and that, incorporates, I mean, this is in Sam's new book, but, they incorporate a lot of questionable elements from American society ultimately into that movement. But, the highbrow version of it that's like, hey, since we all agree, we ought to like cooperate in a political party. Like it's a little hard to argue with that, I think, on some level.
Well, because I'm on video, so I hesitate to get up and go grab the Polarizers, which is behind me in the living room, so I can check to see who the name of the cartoonist, because the name escapes me. But the cartoon you mentioned it's from 1958. It is it's like a trip to the American political zoo, I think, and it's a boy with his new voter guide talking to Uncle Sam and looking at this cage, and it's these two freakish Democratic Republican hybrids. And he says, which one is the Republicrat and which one is the Demopublican? The cartoonist who wrote that, name escapes me, but he himself was a conservative Republican.
Yeah.
It made sense for all sides involved, but his critique was coming from the right.
Absolutely.
I actually grabbed your book, Sam.
Oh, okay.
It was pretty fun. Let me see if I can find it really. Oh, here it is. Yeah.
It's right in chapter 1. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the one. So good. So good. So going back, Matt, a minute ago, like we were just talking about with members, elected office holders who represent places that don't necessarily look like their designation in political parties, right? So Joe Manchin, a Democrat in West Virginia. Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, a Democrat in a very rural portion of Washington state, right? We talk about how, and you talked about how, it's kind of like foreign essentially for them to be able to be representing these places, and the rise and perpetuation of the, like you were mentioning, Sam, the party activism stuff will make it so that, okay, you have to be hardline on this to be a Democrat, even if you are representing a place that may not align with your values as an activist person, right? So let's get into a little bit more of even, Matt, you've written about murder-suicide politics, how are we messing things up in terms of extremism, permitting, essentially depolarizing office holders to be in a position of being able to influence decision making in party leadership, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different things kind of happen simultaneously, but I think one of them is that people have become a little bit, misinformed informed about what's sort of really happening. And a lot of activists kind of people seem to have a self-conception that they are constantly getting sold out by their party's elected officials, when what's normally true is that activists have, substantive issue agendas that the electorate is not necessarily that interested in, which doesn't mean that they're wrong, but it's if you decide that as a matter of incredible moral fervor, we need to, address climate harms that are going to accrue 80 years in the future, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a tough agenda. That's different from just kind of surveying people in their community and being like, what do you want me to do? And similarly, Republicans are incredibly sincere in their belief that low taxes on rich people is morally just and has all kinds of vigorous long-term benefits. And so then you try to say well, how do I get parties to enact these ambitious agendas? And some of it is, activism and primaries and donations. But you also see, you've seen very much with the war in Gaza, which is an instance where, President Biden has very clearly broken with what progressive activists think he ought to do on Israel. But he's been in line with the majority of the public. And so there's a lot of sense that left activists should essentially blow the party up, right? That if you can credibly threaten to defect, then you can create a situation where, no, your political incentives are always to stay with your base, even if your base's view is unpopular. And that's a dangerous game. But we saw, Ralph Nader's campaign in 2000 was, I think, an influential moment in the history of America, that, Bill Clinton had 2 terms in office as a very popular, successful president. Al Gore, most people preferred him to Bush. He won the median voter. He won the national popular vote. If the electoral system had been different, he would have become president, but he didn't. And, the Democrats have become a lot more left-wing sort of since that period, for a whole bunch of different kinds of reasons. But, it's not a question of Bush and Gore were offering completely sordid policy agendas, but just not as large of a gap between them as would sort of emerge between Biden and Trump, or Obama and Mitt Romney. And that's an ongoing sort of working of the system. One of the things I like about Sam's book is that it shows the institutional continuities in this polarization process. He talks about some specific individuals like Heather Booth, who I met in 2008, 2009. She was doing organizing work around the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I had no idea about this long backstory in progressive activist politics. But it shows, people were really working first on the right to formalize the conservative coalition. And then on the left to kind of go beyond the New Deal sort and create a mirror image of the conservative movement that would be, very fuse labor unions and new left ideas into this really sort of transformational agenda for America. Joe Biden is not the politician who those people wanted to lead the Democratic Party, but they've become clearly influential enough that the Biden administration spends a good amount of time thinking about and worrying about sort of progressive movement reactions to him. And that's a relatively new, the process is long-standing, but the development of a movement with enough institutional clout and enough institutional money that an incumbent Democratic Party president and his team will spend a lot of time sweating, progressive critique from the left is fairly new. And, it's had some better, some good things have happened as a result of this, but I think it's also, puts the country at some significant risks at a perilous time.
I will say, I mean, I should have more of on the one hand, to talk my new book, co-authored with our mutual friend, Daniel Schlozman. Part of the story of you had the sort and then decades of what you would say increase in the variance, the kind of spread of agendas on the two parties. Part of it is a story of formal party organizations and organizations of elected as being the preeminent collective organizations representing the interests of elected officials, but also other kinds of organized factions of elected officials, have, for a variety of reasons and through a variety of forces, kind of diminished somewhat in their ability to steer the ship, or at least be a voice in competition with issue-driven activists and ideological activists of various kinds. And at the same time, you've gotten the kind of development of just this huge swarm, what we call blobs, of para-party organizations that are not, they're not nominating elected officials and competing in elections. They think about electoral dynamics and incentives, but to a varying extent, how central that is just varies by organization. They have all these other different kinds of incentives, and you lose something really important in politics, just practically speaking, when you disorganize the voices of the very people who are the ones who are immediately preoccupied with election and re-election.
Yeah, and I was thinking about actually another piece that was in Matt's publication, but he didn't write. It came out this week. Had to give that disclaimer. But it kind of went into like the details of how former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich was a Republican, and he decreased the congressional work week from 5 days to 3 days. And so like there's just all these different elements of structural reform, quote unquote, that have increased polarization. In this instance, it's been said, members spending less time in Washington means they spend less time with each other. And I don't know if you've ever heard Representative Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez mention this, but she intentionally goes to the bipartisan CrossFit workouts, and she goes to the bipartisan Bible study, which I think she said she's like one of the only Democrats in the Bible study. Which, we definitely need more of that happening. But, when we think about all these activities and opportunities for depolarizing activities, such as, frankly, spending time together, you kind of see why we've gotten to this position of such extremism and polarization and, frankly, just not communicating well with people who may have a different partisan view of you as you. Do you guys have any thoughts on other instances that have contributed to this polarization that may not be as well known? Because, I'm sure that even people listening to this may not have even known that the two parties weren't separated along ideological lines, several, more than several decades ago. And even, in your book, Sam, you mentioned that Gallup did a poll about, do people want a conservative and liberal party? And people said largely no, and so it's like, well, no. If people didn't want it and it happened, and now we're in this position where it just continues to get worse because of all these other reasons that compound it, what are we going to do?
I mean, I think a few like big structural things happening here that matters. Like one is the population's gotten more educated, right? So people have just the average person's understanding of political concepts, which is like still not great, honestly, is a lot better than it was when, my grandfather graduated high school, and that put him in the top half of the education distribution at his time. He was a pointy-headed elite, my other grandfather had a PhD, but like that's become way more common. And so people, do like understand politics more in a sense of like issues and ideologies. But the media has changed too. So, now, no matter where you live, you probably know a lot about AOC and what's her name, Marjorie Taylor Greene, because those are like big characters. And you probably don't know anything about like your state senator, who's like just some guy, right? And then there's been a broader trend of sort of declining associational life. I mean, Robert Putnam uses bowling leagues as his example, but there's just like less likely that you will be involved in like a thing. And the thing isn't about politics, but you and your buddies in the thing might be talking about some common problem. And then you might petition your elected official, who might be somebody you actually know something about, and like ask him. And then there would be newspaper articles about that. And other people would be reading about this kind of community-based, like issue-focused, but not national politics. And now it's just not like that. I mean, lots of people don't care that much about politics. And so they don't have that much clout in the system. Other people do care a lot about politics. And so they have a lot of influence and they know about, yeah, I mean, right? So like I'm trying now to like help foster less polarized politics, but that still consists of me living and working in Washington, D.C., talking to donor advisors about key races and telling them that they should support Janelle Bynum in some Oregon suburbs where like I've never been. And none of the people, you know, it's like, so I'm like trying to correct the structural forces that I think have led to this kind of extremism, but it's still through this same process of politics becoming more abstract and the people who show up having disproportionate influence. And if people with fairly extreme views are just more likely to participate in a world where the internet has made it easier to participate, you can research different races, you can do, you know, swap takes and likes and donate to all kinds of people everywhere. We've become more affluent as a society. So like people can expend more material resources on pursuing their political hobbies. They are not dependent. You know, if like the ward boss tried to give you a free turkey, like you wouldn't change your partisan allegiances over something that petty. Cause like we're not that poor and we know more about the universe. I mean, all of just, which is to say that like, I think it's very unlikely that anything will ever change by like reversing the processes that got us to where we are. Whereas like you might just do new things that are different, right? I think that a lot of people who are turned off by the extremism of the political system decide that they want to now not care about politics. And I want to like convince people that no, it's like you should care, right? It's not cheating by activists with extreme opinions to like bother to participate in the system. Right. Like that's how you win. And like, that's just what you have to do. Like that is the democracy, right? You can't just sit around and whine and be like, oh, it's not fair. They care more about the people who actually register and vote in primaries. Like, of course, that's what they care more about.
Yeah. I mean, I would say various things since I wrote the Polarizers. Polarizers is in part a story about nationalizing politics. And the polarizers, you know, polarization and nationalization are kind of two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. And the polarizers were very consciously advocates of nationalizing politics and partisanship in the U.S., in part, you know, because they were dealing with actors that had a lot of subnational power and they were their antagonists in the actual things they were fighting about. But they also had this like broader sense that like the national government, it takes a national activist state to do things like enforce real equal rights among the country's citizens. It takes a national state to really tame capitalism and build a social democracy, et cetera. But there's a lot of both the country remains still a federal polity where a lot of decision making happens at the state and local level. And there's just like lots of stuff that state and local, that being involved in state and local politics and in local civic life uh, actually does affect the kind of circumstances of people's everyday lives. And this is something I just struggle with, because Matt's totally right. You can't, um, you are not going to turn back the tides of history so that we all have bowling leagues and we're Rotarians and we're in, the 4-H club, or build classic old civically rooted party organizations. But you do, I mean, you're going to have Eitan Hirsch on this, right? I believe I saw.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book that people should read. It's a good kind of like, he's like grabbing his liberal readers by the lapels and saying, politics is for power. That's his kind of hard-nosed version of it. But he's also saying, like, the world would be better if people who cared about public policy and cared about politics because it gave them pleasure as hobbyists, directed those energies into doing stuff around them. And it could be very technocratic and policy oriented, what you do. And it just happens to be the case that local issues and local conflicts and local interests don't map perfectly with national. So like NIMBY fights are a good example of like something that happens in state and local politics that don't perfectly match the kind of ideological divide you see in national politics. And there's all sorts of stuff like that. And so that in and of itself depolarizes things by introducing cross-cutting kind of loyalties and interests into political struggle. And also, one thing you hope is that the more people are engaged in conflict, even conflict rather than just kumbaya bowling together, the more people are engaged in politics that is about concrete things that matter to particular communities, the less abstract and kind of, tribal, to use a word that is bandied about a lot, political conflict gets, the better. The less polarized it is, and the more constructive politics might look.
Another book that I liked a lot is Andrew Hall's book. This is called Who Wants to Run? And, like one of the points he makes is that it's like not that financially rewarding to win elections, particularly for state legislatures. And, so then you tend to get ideologues, running as a kind of a hobby rather than people who are like, okay, this is my job. My job is to make a majority of people in my district want to vote for me. And some of that then reflects itself in like concrete material incentives facing members, right? Because, one problem all frontline members face is that their fate is to a large extent out of their hands, right? There's nothing Republicans in D+2 seats could have done to avoid losing in 2008. George W. Bush was just too unpopular. You can maximize your odds of winning by being moderate, by doing bipartisan bills, et cetera, but it's always going to be kind of an uphill climb. So you have to ask yourself, like, what's going to happen to me if I lose? And being somebody who the base likes, being somebody who is set up for a career in media, to be a Fox News or MSNBC talking head, is something that kind of weighs on people. But then some of it is just the mentality. If you go back to like, who wants to run for state senate? If it's not, there's a world in which it's just kind of like gregarious people, who like talking to crowds, and they're just out there on the hustings trying to win. But in most states, it doesn't pay well enough for that to make sense. And it's like probably good that we don't have corrupt patronage machines. But that also means that, what you're doing when you're running for office is you're trying to get other people to give you money so that you can win. It's not, if I win, then I can hand out all this money to all my supporters. So that it encourages, to be nice about it, people with principles, to run for office. But then when you look at it, what's striking is very few Americans look at politics of 2024 and say to themselves, wow, this is amazing. Like, what a great clash of principled, high-minded people that we have here, right? Like, they think, oh, this is bad. It's a lot of knuckle-dragging morons, ideological freaks, people who don't listen, people who don't care about me, et cetera, et cetera. And, you want some constructive tension, I think, between the impulse to just pander and the impulse to like sit in your study and be like, here's how the world should be. I don't care what the voters think, right? And we've tilted, I think, very far toward a politics dominated by real ideologues who I think view public opinion as like an impediment to work around, rather than like see it as their job to like ask people what they think and represent them, right? And that was part of that kind of old critique of polarization, right? Was that you had a lot of ethnic and sectarian diversity in the United States, and a lot of what parties used to be was just kind of, if the Irish are Democrats, the Italians will be Republicans, and then the community will be represented like as a community. And then you could do trades and try to help people out. And it's harder to do that in a politics of principle because people still have these kind of concrete interests that they want. And you can't always make up like a completely coherent reason why like your town should just get to continue to have a viable economy. But like that's what people want, what they want, and the political system has to find ways to mediate that.
Yeah, I think it's totally right. This again is the new book. The kind of historical part of it is again much more than when I wrote the Polarizers. We were keyed into across American history that there's just like robust traditions of American politics, other than ideological issue-driven politics, which has its place and has more of a place, I think, rightfully so, in the 21st century than in the past, perhaps. But that constructive tension is exactly right, that there are real virtues and important functions served by traditions. One of the ones we call is the accommodationist strand in American history, that politics is a profession. Politics and party politics is about effectively and without a kind of pre-existing ideological agenda or policy agenda, incorporating and mobilizing your community into participation in politics and meeting them where they are and figuring out what matters to them, no matter how unsystematic it is or perhaps confused on one issue or another. And you want that as part of your kind of democratic electoral system, small d democratic electoral system. And that I'm not a particularly moderate guy, but like, I think it's important for political parties to have really efficacious and organized voices on behalf of the imperative to meet voters where they are and have an accurate sense of what it is that matters to people.
Yeah, and I'm going to get into one last question before our last fun question, which I think I mentioned to you is essentially, can you explain to listeners a depolarizing action that they should or could do, something to read, someone to listen to, someone to look up, someone to donate to for that matter, as their depolarization activity for the day of the week. But my last question, so we talked about this before, but it seems like there is always so much more emphasis on mobilizing the base and trying to appeal to, young voters or Black voters who, for both of those demographics, particularly young voters are increasingly becoming independents, and Black voters self-identify as moderate and conservative more than they do liberal. But you find that often people, like we were mentioning MGP and Senator Manchin, people who emphasize intra-party dissent or differentiation from their party brand or differentiation from even just the activist base of their party, they get more penalized than they do praised. And yet most of America is in the middle, right? And, Matt, again, in your piece about polarization being a choice, you mentioned how Hillary Clinton ran to the left of Obama, and Trump, from a policy perspective, was more of a moderate, right? And it's like, well, that's where people were. They're in the center, right? And so, I don't know, trying to get into like the vein of, why do we, glorify polarization so much as a problem when, I mean, granted, it is a problem, but, when we should be focusing more on the depolarizing activities in individuals, so that we can essentially meet Americans literally where they are ideologically, largely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of meeting people where they are, and there's also a question of I don't know, like priority setting and doing things right where anything, people, it's simplistic to think of, well, it's extreme, it's moderate, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're trying to push for large change on like a dozen different issues all simultaneously, like that's hard. And there's no real evidence to think that anybody wants that, right? And I think there's a tendency to look at Americans' deep dissatisfaction with the political system and then conclude that means people want large, like systematic, large policy change. But people mostly say that they're like happy in their own lives. They're, it's a fairly wealthy country. People are pretty risk averse across all kinds of dimensions. You see a lot of backlash anytime like a newly empowered government comes in and tries to do things. And so I think just to recognize that a good deal of the alienation from the system consists of people trying to push so much change through it. Now, still, like, we have problems, and it would be nice to solve them, and people have various analyses of those problems. But just to recognize it's really unlikely that there's going to be this kind of, we're going to get 50% plus one, and then we're going to like run the table, and we're going to enact like a great society level of change. When if you look at like the sweeping changes of the Great Society, they happened at a time when the level of polarization was fairly low. Those bills passed on big bipartisan margins, and it's hard to imagine how you're going to recover that exactly. But that's what it was. You know what I mean? There wasn't some time when, because like we don't have the UK's political institutions or system, so just copying their parties and thinking you can have like a Thatcher level like blitz of the policy dynamic, like it doesn't really make sense, and you need to think harder about how American politics works and the very strong incentives that exist to sort of pursue bipartisan approaches or to, have in the spirit of like an Eisenhower or Bill Clinton, presidencies that delivered like non-earth-shattering results, but that were very popular and that, people liked and that accommodated the kind of big social forces that were swirling at the moment.
All right. Now, at last, depolarizing activity for our listeners. Who wants to go first?
Man, I don't know. I think I scooped myself talking about Eitan Hirsch's book, but like that stuff, people should do as much as it's not. I don't do it. I'm a classic hobbyist. I'm like a professional political hobbyist. I just sit around and for a living write about national politics. So don't do as I do, but do as much as you can to look around your actual community and work with others in your community. It might not even be for, quote unquote, moderate ends, but like whatever you think is a problem in your community, get together with other people who live around you and actually organize and work to affect change in local politics.
Well, I think everyone should just subscribe to Slow Boring.
There you go.
Get all their information that way. No, I mean, I do want to. I've been a little bit involved with some other parents in my school through the PTA in like a 100% self-interested like local politics thing. But I mean, it's not like my narrow self-interest. It's like our collective self-interest as people who like attend 3 particular schools in one geographic area. And it's interesting because, people come to it with different presuppositions, and we're trying to come up with arguments that we more or less all agree with, and that also we think will be persuasive to stakeholders in the political system. And it's just different from like posting for clout, and it habituates you to a slightly different way of thinking. But I would also say, think about people in your life who don't care enough about politics to listen to this podcast, who are a little bit tuned out and like think like the parties are bad or something, and like try to specifically invest them in like taking action and doing things instead of whining from the sidelines, because there are these big structural forces at work that have transformed like how American society is. But I don't think it's a law of nature that like the only people who care about politics or will participate in the process are people who want to like abolish the United States and make it Sweden. Like it's just, there's like a lot of opinions you could have about politics that are still worth getting fired up about, and finding politicians who you agree with and like say nice things about them. And like it's a nationalized media and fundraising ecosystem, but like it's still one we can all play a role in. We don't need to just like leave the field empty.
Absolutely. You heard it from Matt himself. Check out more episodes of the Depolarizers. Subscribe to Slow Boring. Read Sam's books, The Polarizers and The Hollow Parties. Speaking of Eitan and Andy Hall, we'll have both of them on following episodes of The Depolarizers. So excited to have them on. Matt, Sam, thank you all so much for your time today. So enjoyed our conversation, and hope you got all your thoughts out today. And if not, come back and chat with us. But thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.